Island of the Dead, Miami, Florida, June 2019. It was a typical hot summer in Florida, and out in the Miami Bay was a lone yacht drifting as if there was no passenger there. And a boat from the harbor patrol was approaching the drifting yacht as they have gotten reports of the yacht drift into oncoming boat traffic, nearly causing collisions. Well, two patrolmen tie the small boat to the yacht and they board. There was nobody on the deck of the yacht. The sails were unsecured and flapping wildly in the wind. The one patrolman tells his partner, "I'm going below deck to see what's going on." The other patrolman acknowledges, and the patrolman goes down below deck. Below deck was another story. There looked like there was a struggle down there. There was objects all over the floor, food that was rotting, and there was a foul smell of death emanating from there. And the patrolman drew his gun and he shouted, "Hello! Hello! Anyone there?" As he looked around, he saw a piano. It was a small piano, but he saw something on the piano keys. It looked like a severed hand, and as he went in for a closer look, to his horror, it was a severed hand on the piano keys, along with some earthworms, and he says aloud, "Oh God, what the?" And all of a sudden, the closet door bursted right open, and a huge, massive, fat man comes shambling out at high speed towards a police officer. The police officer screams, "Halt! Put your hands in the air!" But then the man was not listening and tackled the police officer. A struggle ensued as the man had the police officer pinned to the floor of the deck. And as he was struggling, the morbidly obese man quickly lowered his head and bit into the police officer's neck, tearing out a giant chunk. In the process, the police officer let off a shot from his gun. The other officer above deck heard the shot and quickly pulled out his gun and was heading towards the entrance to below deck when all of a sudden the massive obese man comes out at high speed, also shambling towards the officer. But that officer did not even yell freeze. He began to shoot at the man. After nearly shooting all the rounds of his clip into the hulking fat man, the attacker finally fell into the waters. And then the young officer ran down below deck to see his partner, still alive but barely, holding on to the massive wound in his neck as it was bleeding out, and with the other hand reaching out towards him. And the young officer quickly radioed for help. Later, the yacht was docked at a port, and the police were coming through the entire yacht. It was now a crime scene. And at the docks was a young woman, thin-billed, blue eyes, and reddish-brown hair. And she was being interrogated by the detective. The detective asked her, "Miss Bowles, according to the records, this yacht is registered to your father, Dr. Alan Bowles." And the woman says, "Yes." And then she goes on to explain to the detective, "But I haven't seen my father since February. He went out to the Caribbean, some little island out there, to research something. He didn't tell me much, and I haven't heard from him since then." And then she goes on to ask the detective, "What's going on? Now you're telling me that someone attacked and killed a cop on board that yacht, and you don't see any signs of my father or anyone else." And then the detective says to the woman, "Well, Miss Bowles, that's why we're asking you the questions, because according to the logbook, the yacht had been out at sea since last month, but your father was not aboard." And then she tells the detective, well then, detective sir, I can't help you because like I said, I haven't heard from my dad since he left in February. And if he was not on board, that means he's still out there. Maybe the yacht was stolen. The next morning, at a local Miami newspaper, a young man by the name of Peter West, he was a man of 37. He had brownish hair that was starting to thin, and he was a tall man of 6'1" and brown eyes. He was walking into the editor-in-chief's office of the newspaper, and the editor-in-chief says to him, Peter, sit down. The man sits down, and then he goes on to explain to Peter, well, Peter, I have a big story for you to cover. This happened yesterday, he says to Peter, and he goes on to explain about the incident out in the docks. And Peter says to the editor-in-chief, Mr. Walden, sir, I really don't want to do that story. I want to do that story about the drug smuggling operation going on out at Key West. And Walden says, now, Peter, because your dad owns the newspaper doesn't mean you get to do whatever story you want. And then Peter says, well, okay, Mr. Walden, but I'm telling you, that story is so open and shut, it's probably just going to be 6 paragraphs on the paper. Later on that night at the docks, the yacht was still moored there, and there was one patrol car with one police officer sound asleep behind the wheel. And Peter snuck into the yacht. He had his flashlight as he looked around below deck. He was amazed of the mess that was down there. As he was snooping around, suddenly he ran into a woman and let out a loud howl. Ugh! And then the woman said, shh, you're going to let the cop know that we're here. And then Peter asked her, who the hell are you? And then the woman introduces herself. My name is Ann Bowles. This yacht belonged to my father. I'm trying to find out what happened to him. And then Peter says, well, thank you, Miss Bowles. Now the cop probably knows there's people in here. And then, of course, the police officer wakes up from his deep sleep, pulls out his gun and pulls out his flashlight and boards the yacht. And as he was heading below deck, he screams, okay, who's down there? You have 5 seconds to come out with your hands up. Peter asks Anne, I have an idea how we can get out of this, but are you willing to do this? And Anne asks, what do you mean? What am I willing to do? And then the cop walks below deck as he shines his flashlight in every corner and screams, okay, who's ever down there, come out with your hands up. And then when he finally turned the flashlight to shine on the last corner, there was Peter and Anne. Both of them had their pants down. They looked like they were in the midst of getting ready to do it, and the cop let out a slight look of his face like, really? And then Peter says, oh God, officer, this is embarrassing. I'm so sorry. Yeah, you know, women, man, they want some fun, they want some excitement. I heard about a yacht that was out here, and well, you know. And then the cop says, okay, Romeo, just pull your pants up and get the hell out of here. And then Peter says, oh, thank you, officer. And then both of them pull their pants up and then quickly leave the yacht. Later on, at a little Havana cafe, the two got to know each other on better formal circumstances. And then Peter explained who he was and what he was doing. And of course, Anne was explaining what she was doing. And then she explained before Peter discovered her, she had found her father's journal. But she tells Peter that she can't read shorthand. And then Peter asks her if he could see the journal. She slides the journal across the table. And then Peter looks at it and he says, oh yeah, I can read shorthand perfectly fine. Then Anne's face lit up with a smile. And then Peter began to speed read through the journal. He went past all the boring parts and then saw something interesting. Anne could see the expression of his face of puzzlement. Then she asked, Peter, what's going on? And then Peter says to her, I really don't know, Anne. This thing's starting to get weird. And then he began to read further and further and was reading about zombies on an island named Matul and how he had become infected with whatever was bringing the dead back to life. And then he goes on to ask Anne, if I tell you what's in this journal, will you believe me? And then she says to Peter, yes. Is it absurd sounding? She asks him. And then Peter says to her, I'm having doubts right now. What your dad wrote in here sounds like something out of a bad horror movie. Maybe he was trying to write a novel or something. And then Anne says, no, my dad is not the one to write books, and my dad is not the one to fabricate stories or do outlandish things. And then Peter looked both ways to make sure there was really no one around to hear what he was about to read to Anne. And then he read the more interesting parts of the journal to Anne. And Anne was like, zombies on an island? What is going on? Does it say if my dad is alive or not? And then Peter says to her, in this part here, in this entry dated April 28th, it says that he was infected and that he might die. And then it says here, if my daughter finds us, I love her dearly, and I will look down on her from heaven. And then Anne's eyes started to tear up. And then Peter says, well, you know what? I have an idea, he says. We're going to Matul. Peter pulls out his smartphone and looks up Matul, and he sees that Matul was in the Leeward Islands, and it was pretty remote. And then he says to Anne, I think the only way we're going to really get out there is by boat. And then he does some further investigating, and he says, well, our best shot is we'll take a flight to the Virgin Islands, and then from the Virgin Islands we can try to charter a boat out to Matul. And then Anne says, well, I'm game, Peter. Just give me some time to get my passport straight now. And Peter says, yeah, I got to talk to the editor-in-chief to see if he's going to let me do this. And then Peter asks Anne, who's this Dr. Menard that I see that your dad mentions throughout the journal? And then Anne says, oh, Dr. Menard, he's a doctor that's with Doctors Without Borders. He was out there in Matul to treat the people since they don't have, access to, a lot of medical stuff out there, she says. And then Peter's like, okay, that's cool. Maybe we can contact him when we get out there to Matul, he says to her. Meanwhile, in the Miami coroner's office, the police officer who was killed by that zombie was laying in the morgue. He was covered up to his neck with a white sheet, and the coroner was ready to make the autopsy when he noticed his assistant had erroneously wrote down on the paperwork that the man was killed by a cut to the neck. And then he tells the man, no, he was not cut in the neck. And then the coroner tells his assistant, look, see here in the wounds of the neck? That's not marks made by a blade. Those are marks made by teeth, he says to the assistant. And he says to the assistant, the police report indicate that this man was attacked and killed by a lunatic in a yacht. And then the assistant said, sorry, doctor. And then he goes to hand the scalpel to the coroner, and the coroner looks at the scalpel and he says, my God, man, what's going on here? This scalpel can cut through paper, let alone flesh. The assistant says to the doctor, I'm sorry, doctor. And the coroner says, you need to learn to take better care of the instruments, he says to the assistant. And as he was still screaming at the assistant, unbeknownst to them, they were not seeing the hands of the dead policeman moving underneath the sheet. He was starting to come back to life. A few days later, an airplane lands in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Peter and Anne were walking down the docks of a busy marina. They were looking for any boat to charter. They see one boat there that looked big enough and comfortable enough, and there was a tall, very well-built white man with reddish blonde hair and a thick mustache, and a very thin-built woman with short, dark hair that was curly. Peter walks up to the man and he says, ahoy there, my name is Peter West, and this lady here is Anne Bowles. We're looking to charter a boat ride. The man looks at both of them and he says to them, well, my name is Clyde Culver, and this is my wife Brianna. We're here on vacation too. And then he goes on to say to Peter, let me guess, some swimming, sunshine, and some fishing. And Peter says, not really. we're looking to get to an island out in the Lesser Antilles by the name of Matul. And then Clyde's very jovial face quickly turns sour, and he says to Peter, Matul, you know there's a deadly plague going on out there. And Peter says, well, I'm aware of that, and we're going out there to find her father, who's a doctor out there. And then Clyde says, well, I learned over the years it pays to heed local native superstitions. And then Peter says, listen, Mr. Culver, if it's money, I have plenty. I can give you $5,000 if you could take us out there. And then Clyde says, okay, Mr. West, you have yourself a deal. We'll take you and your lady friend out to Matul, but don't expect us to go sightseeing with you, he says. And then Peter says, oh, thank you, Clyde. And Clyde says to Peter, we leave within the hour. Well, meanwhile, out in the island of Matul, a tiny island out in the Lesser Antilles, it's very isolated. There's a very small population of people living out there, and it's not a place that's frequently visited by tourists. It has a rustic charm to it, and let's just say it's not an ideal place to choose to live at if you really want to live out in the tropics. In a small but luxurious cottage, Dr. Menard was at his radio, and he kept on trying to raise somebody on the radio, saying, Guadalupe 1, Guadalupe 1, this is Dr. Menard, come in. Guadalupe 1, Guadalupe 1, this is Matul, come in. Is there anyone out there? Come in. Guadalupe, Guadalupe, come in. Dr. Menard, a man in his mid-50s with a thick beard that was turning gray, along with a matte black hair that was also starting to turn gray on the sides, was visibly upset that no one was answering him. And then his attractive, somewhat younger wife walks in, and she says, well, anything, honey? And then Dr. Menard says, nothing. I can't raise anyone on the radio. And then his wife was starting to get visibly angry, because I bet you destroyed that radio. And then Menard gets up angrily and says to his wife, I did not destroy that radio. The problem is, I should have put in a very tall aerial. Maybe we could have got a few of the outer islands somewhere. And then she says to her husband, and what about the internet? And Dr. Menard says to her, well, honey, you know, the internet is just like the radio. If I had someone I could reach, maybe we could get help. And then his wife angrily says to her husband, I can't believe this. I cannot believe this. I am trapped out here in this little pissant island, and the dead are coming back to life. And then Dr. Menard says, well, I'm trapped out here too, and right now, I'm the only one that could probably save everybody on this island. And then his wife, getting nastier, says, oh, look at you, Mr. Hero Doctor. Well, I know what you are. I'm willing to tell the world what you are. Just a fraud. You're just doing this to see if you can probably get a fortune out of this. You don't care about these people. You don't care about nothing. All you care about is just trying to make a big name for yourself at the expense of the innocent. Angry, Dr. Menard was about to slap his wife, but he stopped himself, and he calmed himself down. And then he says, you know what, woman, I'm not going to listen to your ignorance. And then his wife quickly apologized. I'm sorry, honey. I'm just sorry. I'm just getting anxious. This whole dead coming back to life, it's scary. I've never seen anything like this. It's like we're in a bad horror movie, and we're so isolated. Matul's so isolated. Why did you take this posting in the first place? Dr. Menard went on to comfort his wife and says, it's okay, honey. It's okay. Then his wife goes over to the far table where there was a bottle of rum. She opens the bottle of rum and pours a shot and starts drinking. And then Dr. Menard says to her, honey, it's not a good idea to drink. And then she says to her husband, well, how do you expect me to calm my nerves here? And then she asked her husband, are they still over there in the other end of the island? The doctor says, yes, they're still on the other side of the island. And then she asks her husband, how long before they come to this side? And then Dr. Menard says, I don't know, and I hope they don't come at all. I just hope it's, forget it, he says to her, forget it. I got to go to the clinic. And then she screams at her husband, "That's right, go to the clinic. You always run to the clinic where you're safe there." And then Dr. Menard says to his wife, "Well, honey, goodbye. I love you. I'll see you tomorrow," he says to her. And then he leaves his cottage and he tells his gardener, Manuel, "Manuel, make sure no one, I mean no one, comes to the cottage." And Manuel says, "Si, senor, si." Manuel makes sure nobody come to cottage. And then Dr. Menard gets into his beat up old Land Rover and heads off to the town to the clinic. Meanwhile, in the doctor's makeshift laboratory in the very run-down hospital, he was sweating bullets in there. It was super hot. And the lab equipment left little to be desired. And he was just looking at every microscope slide, mainly of blood samples. He would pull out one slide, put in the other slide, and then afterwards he go grab a syringe and draw blood out of his own arm, and then inject the blood sample onto a microscope dish, and then look at his blood sample under the microscope. Meanwhile, out at sea, the boat that belonged to Clyde was going across the ocean at normal speed. Then Clyde quickly turns off the engine, and then Peter walks up to where Clyde was, and he asks, "Hey, what's going on, man?" And then he says to Peter, "I got to get my bearings straight," as he pulls out the map and a compass. And then he says to Peter, "Well, I'm going to tell you for one thing, man, Matul is not an easy place to reach." And then he looks at the map, and Peter asks him, "So how much more do we have?" He then tells Peter, "We got about 40 more miles to go." Then Anne climbs up to where the two men were at, and she asks, "Hey, what's going on? Why did we stop moving?" Then Peter told her what was going on, and then Clyde says, "Well, you see those two islands that we just passed?" Peter says, "Yeah, well, they're not on any map. We have to be careful out here. There's so many uncharted islands all over this place. I really don't want to end up stuck on one." And then Peter says, "I understand." And then Brianna comes out and she says, "Well, guys, since we stopped, how about some lunch?" And then Peter says, "Oh, yes, I could eat something right now." And Anne asks Brianna, "What's for lunch?" And Brianna says to them, "Cold cuts and some orange soda." And Peter says, "All right." And then everyone started eating and enjoying. And all of a sudden, the boat violently rocks. Everyone falls to the ground, but they quickly get back up to look over the side of the boat. And there they saw a massive tiger shark that was attacking the boat. Clyde quickly runs to get his rifle, and then he begins to shoot at the shark in the water. Everyone began to see blood. Clyde had hit the shark. After the shark was dead, Clyde says, "Oh God, I hope that son of a you-know-what didn't damage anything beneath the boat." Meanwhile, back on the island of Matul, we see a very old wooden church. It looked like that church had stood there for centuries, and it was rotting away. And it was now the home of the makeshift hospital that Dr. Menard used to treat the victim of the mysterious plague that was bringing the dead back to life. And outside the makeshift hospital, a violent wind was blowing that was blowing sand, palm fronds, and other garbages across the way. And in front of the church, too, were a bunch of lone goats wandering along. Inside the hospital, the conditions were very horrible, and of course it looked more like a hospice home than a hospital. There were several beds and one rowboat that was in there that was turned into a makeshift bed. Probably about 11 beds in total there, and all the beds were filled up with the dying. Whatever this thing was that was bringing the dead back to life was also infecting the living with a nasty virulent flu-like symptom, vomiting, diarrhea, and then on top of that, hemorrhaging. And in that hospital was one lone white nurse trying to attend to those who were dying. There was nothing much that her and Dr. Menard could do. All they could do was blood transfusions and give them all morphines to calm their delirium. As they all were just slowly slipping away, each one, every day, more and more people were dying, and there was nothing that they could do. The nurse walks up to one of the patients, and it looks like he was in his last stages, and she screams, "Dr. Menard! Dr. Menard!" Dr. Menard hurriedly comes towards her, and she says, "Dr. Menard, I don't think he's going to make it." And then Dr. Menard examines the patient. He opens the patient's eyes to look into it as he shines a light to it. And then afterwards, he takes a stethoscope out and listens to the patient's heartbeat. And then he says to her, "Take him to the sacristy, tie him down securely. He's going to die very soon," he says to her, and then he goes on to say to her, "There's no need to alarm the others." She says, "Yes, Dr. Menard." Then the door to the makeshift hospital flies open, and a medium-height black man of average build comes running in. He quickly shuts the door behind him, and he says, "Doctor! Doctor! Everybody in the village has left. Everybody!" And then Dr. Menard told the man, "Shh! Come on, let's go outside to talk." And then the two men walk outside, and then the man says to the doctor, "Dr. Menard, everyone in the village had packed their possession and left. They listened to the Juju man, the new Juju man. He's possessed with 1,000 devils from hell," said the black man. And then Dr. Menard asked him, "Where did he take him?" Then the black man said, he took him inland. They're going to do voodoo to try to stop this evil that has befallen on the island." And then Dr. Menard says to the man, "Oh, come on, Lucas. Voodoo's not going to work," finally identifying the black man by name. And then he goes on to say, "Only science can stop whatever is causing this." And then Lucas said, "But Dr. Menard, they are scared. Everyone is scared." And Dr. Menard says to Lucas, "You're afraid too, aren't you, Lucas?" And Lucas says, "Yes, Dr. Menard, I am very afraid. I have not seen your miracle of science solve nothing. All I see is that your hospital is just one giant cemetery. Everyone there dies." Then Lucas apologizes to Dr. Menard. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, Dr. Menard. I lost my temper." And Dr. Menard said, "It's okay, Lucas. To tell you the truth, I'm afraid too. I'm afraid." And the two men walk off down the lonely road. Unbeknownst to them, something in the jungle was watching them. Later on, night fell on the island, and in the luxurious cottage of Dr. Menard's wife was taking a cold shower. It was too hot and muggy on that island for a hot shower. And as she was showering away, outside, the gardener, Manuel, was sitting having a cigarette. As he was sitting, a gentle breeze was blowing in from the sea. But then he heard a crunching coming from the jungles around the cottage. Manuel, knowing about what was going on, got fearful and fled. And as Dr. Menard's wife was showering away, unbeknownst to her, something was outside. Something had put its decayed hand on the window outside the bathroom. Something was watching her. So, inside the cottage in her room, Dr. Menard's wife put on her dress after she dried herself off. Then Dr. Menard's wife was frightened as she heard noises coming from within the house of objects falling. Fearful that zombies had got in the house, she quickly closes the bedroom door. The bedroom door was just nothing but weak wooden slats, but she saw a shadow behind the door moving around. She quickly goes over to a bureau and pushes the bureau to block whatever's in the house from getting into the door. But it did no good, as the zombie began to punch through the weakened, slatted doors. And one of the zombie's hands quickly grabs her by her long hair and begins pulling her with great strength. She tried to resist, but she was not a strong woman, and the zombie had incredible strength, and soon other hands reached through the broken door to grab her. It was too late. The doctor's wife was no more. The next day, around noon, off the coast of Matul, at a nearby beach, Clyde's boat was right off the coast, anchored, Peter and Anne were looking over their side, waiting to see if Clyde and Brianna surfaced. And finally, Clyde and Brianna surfaced behind the boat. And Brianna says, after gaining her breath, "The drive shaft is cracked." And Clyde said, "It must have been caused when that tiger shark attacked us." Then Peter asks, "So what's next then, Clyde?" And then Clyde says, "Well, we can get onto the island and see if there's a repair shop nearby. If we can't find anything, then we're out of luck. We won't be able to make it to the next island with that cracked shaft." And then Anne looks at the sky. She sees that the sky was getting dark with black clouds, and she says aloud, "I don't like the look of the sky, guys." And then Clyde says, "I don't like the looks of the sky either." And then Anne asks, "Is there another option?" And Clyde answers, "Yes, I could shoot off emergency flares until somebody finds us." Meanwhile, the only nurse of the makeshift hospital walks all the way down the deserted avenues of the town to the beach. There, she finds Dr. Menard, who was laying on a rocky part of the beach, and in front of him were all the fishing boats, once the lifeblood of the island. Now, with this plague and the dead coming back to life, the boats were just floating there, not being used, rotting away like the town. And Dr. Menard, he was drinking bourbon straight out of the bottle, getting drunk. And then the nurse says to Dr. Menard, "Dr. Menard, it's," and she finally says the name, "Matthias." Dr. Menard lifts his upper body and wipes the drool from his mouth, and he says to the nurse angrily, "What's wrong? You're scared to say the word? Just say the word. He's dead, just like everybody else, and he's going to come back." And then the nurse said, what if what the locals are saying is true?" And then Dr. Menard angrily says to the nurse, "Oh, come on. Don't give me that voodoo hoodoo crap. I'm tired of hearing about it. I know voodoo's a very big religion on this island, but I don't believe in it. There is no magic bringing the dead back to life. There has to be a logical explanation, and I will find it. Damn it," he says. "I wish I had adequate supplies," he says aloud. So Dr. Menard gets up and walks back with the nurse to the hospital. And there he goes over to the bound body of Matthias. Matthias was dead, and just like everybody else, he was going to come back. And his body was wrapped in white linen and tied with rope. And then Dr. Menard pulls out his handgun, a Glock 45. He aims at the head and takes a shot. Meanwhile, it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and Clyde was shooting off an emergency flare from the boat. Followed by another flare. But someone did notice the flares. It was old Lucas, who was out in the back of the hospital digging a massive trench to bury all the dead bodies that were shot. And then Dr. Menard and the nurse come with an old-fashioned carry stretcher with the dead body of Matthias. And then he runs up to Dr. Menard and says, Dr. Menard, someone's shooting rockets." And then Menard looks at the sky, and then he asks Lucas, "Who?" And then Lucas says, "I don't know, but it come from Catfish Bay." Dr. Menard says, "Okay, then I'll go investigate." And then he tells the nurse, "Help Lucas dispose of the body." And the nurse says, "Yes, doctor." And Menard runs off. And then Lucas said, "Who is it, the devil?" And then the nurse says, "No. We will learn soon enough," she says to him. And then her and Lucas throw the wrapped body of Matthias into the giant burial ditch. And Lucas asks the nurse, "You want me to bury?" And the nurse says, "No, we got 2 more people that will die soon." And Lucas does the sign of the cross, and the nurse could hear the wailing and the drumming of the voodoo ritual taking place deep within the island. And then she says to Lucas, "Is that them?" And Lucas says, "Yes, it is them." and I pray that new Juju man can lift the curse that had fallen on this island. And then the nurse says, well, I pray that he can succeed too. I want to get out of here as soon as I can. I have a very bad feeling that this island is going to get overrun very soon. Meanwhile, outside in the deserted town, the streets were strewn with garbage, coconuts, palm fronds, branches, and several little crabs crawling around. But in the very distant, we could see one lone zombie shambling down the deserted avenue. They were now making their way to the side of the island where the hospital's at. Meanwhile, Dr. Menard's beat-up Land Rover was driving down the beach. In it was him and Peter, Anne, Clyde, and Brianna. He had picked them up from the boat, and he was explaining to them everything that was going on, and specifically Anne about the fate of her dad. And he says, well, see, Anne, your father came out here around February. Since about September, this plague that's causing the dead to come back had been going on. And he goes on to say, I remember the first victim was a local woman, the wife of a fisherman. She had died. And then 3 nights later, people saw her wandering around the village. Her husband thought that she was just buried alive, but then when she attacked and killed her husband, we subdued her, and I knew there was something wrong with her. She was not normal. And then he goes on to say, and then many people in the village began getting sick and dying and coming back. And, well, I needed help, he says to Anne, so I emailed your father being a very talented and well-respected doctor that specialized in unknown and obscure diseases, could help me get to the bottom of it. Unfortunately, he couldn't. And then in mid-April, he was starting to show symptoms of that dreaded disease. And then by the end of the month, he was dying. And after he died, I took care of him myself. I sat and I waited until he came back, and as soon as he started moving and lifting his head, I shot him myself. And then he says to Anne, I am sorry, there was nothing we could do. I just wish I could. I mean, I did everything, every analysis, everything. Whatever it's the thing that's causing people to get sick and die and come back from the dead, blood work shows no pathogens of any sort, no bacteria, no virus. And every other analysis I ran comes back negative. Everything seems normal. There is some sort of force causing this. And then Peter asked the doctor, Dr. Menard, what do the locals think about this? And then Menard answers Peter's question, and he says, well, here in this island, voodoo is practiced. It's pretty much the dominant religion here. And the local people believe it is a curse, probably befallen on the island from something that they did wrong. And then Clyde says, oh, come on, doctor. Voodoo's a load of horse shit. It's a mixture of 2 religions. Roman Catholicism brought here by the Spanish, and African tribal religions brought here by the African slaves. And then Dr. Menard says to Clyde, yes, I'm aware of that, but unfortunately, I'm starting to believe in it because all my research is pointing to nothing. And right now, the remaining villagers have fled inland, and you hear that faint drumming in the background? And then Anne says, yes, what is that? And then Dr. Menard says, that's them. The new Juju man and the remaining villagers went deep inland to try to perform a massive voodoo ritual to try to dispel this evil that's fallen on the island. And I wish them all the luck, says Dr. Menard. And he says they've been at it day and night, nonstop. And Brianna asked Dr. Menard, you said the new Juju man. What happened to the old one? She asked the doctor. And Dr. Menard said, well, the old Juju man died fighting the horde of the undead. Finally, the beat-up Land Rover reaches the makeshift hospital. As everyone was getting out, Lucas runs up to see the doctor, and Dr. Menard said, Lucas, I want you to meet Peter West, Ann Bowles, and Clyde and Brianna Culver. And Dr. Menard says to Lucas, their boat broke down right off Catfish Bay. And then Lucas says hello to all of them. And then he says, Dr. Menard, can you please come inside? It's Fritz. And then Dr. Menard says, well, ladies, gentlemen, if you excuse me, Fritz is the only other white man on this island, so let me see what's going on. But at the meantime, I extend my hospitality to you all. You could take this Land Rover and drive 8 miles north. You'll see my cottage. My wife will take care of you all there. She's all alone up there, and I worry about her. And then Peter says, yes, Dr. Menard, thank you for your hospitality. Their group get back into the Land Rover with Clyde driving, and they drive off. And then the two men go into the makeshift hospital. And there, Dr. Menard attends to Fritz, a German man, heavy set, in his mid-60s, with curly cloud white hair and a very serious 5 o'clock shadow going. And then Dr. Menard asks Fritz, what's going on? And then Fritz says, village, zombie attacked and bit me. And then Dr. Menard said frantically, what, in this village? Fritz says, yeah, in this village. And then Dr. Menard turns to look at Lucas, and he says to Lucas, lock all the doors. And Lucas says, yes, Dr. Menard, and runs off. And then Dr. Menard says aloud to himself, oh God, they're here in this village already. Meanwhile, the beat-up Land Rover pulls up to the very luxurious cottage of Dr. Renard. Everyone gets out of the Land Rover, and they admire the beauty of the cottage. It was well kept, and it was probably the nicest part of the island. They all walk up the steps, and Peter rings the doorbell. But there was no answer, and then Peter knocks on the door. Mrs. Menard! Mrs. Menard! Mrs. Menard! But there was no answer. But then out of curiosity, Peter reaches for the doorknob and he twists it. The door opens and the group walks inside, and there was an eerie silence coming from the house. They explored a little ways until they all came upon a horrible sight in the living room. It was the lifeless body of Mrs. Menard, and she was being eaten by the zombies. And lets out a loud scream that got the zombies' attention. And the zombies slowly get up, and they began walking towards them. Peter had noticed that these zombies were not like the zombies in horror movies. Their eyes were completely closed, and they were still able to walk towards him, like they were still able to see. Well, they quickly turned around to run, but from around the corner behind them was another group of zombies. They were surrounded. 3 behind them, 3 in front of them. Quick thinking, Peter saw a brass vase on a table, and he quickly grabbed it and hit a home run with the zombie in front of them, and then swung like a wild man, beating up the other zombies. The group ran out the house, and they quickly got into the old Land Rover and sped off. Clyde was driving again. As he was driving high speed through the rough dirt road, a zombie walks into the road, emerging from the thick jungle. And of course, Brianna saw it, thinking it was just a person that wandered out. She screams, Clyde, look out! Clyde saw the zombie, thinking it was a pedestrian. He quickly jerked the steering wheel a hard left to avoid hitting what he thought was a pedestrian, and took the Land Rover off-road and crashed head-on to a massive tree. It was a nasty crash. Clyde asked if everyone was alright. Everyone said, yeah, I think we are. Then Clyde gets out of the Land Rover and pops the hood open. And he says, well, the engine is done for. I guess we're going to have to go on foot. And then Peter says, I think my foot is done. Clyde runs over to check on Peter. Peter had broke his left ankle. And then he asked Peter, are you able to make it? Peter's like, I got no choice. We gotta get out of here. And then Clyde opens the back of the Land Rover and finds that there was a rifle and a couple of rounds. He takes the rifle and the rounds, and then they go on foot from there, with the girls assisting Peter. Meanwhile, back at the makeshift hospital, Dr. Menard was taking Fritz's pulse. And then he says to the nurse, it's not going to be very long. He's going to be dead soon. And the nurse asks Dr. Menard, Dr. Menard, you want me to start a blood transfusion on him? And Dr. Menard says angrily to her, why waste what few blood we have left on a man who's going to die anyways? And then he says to the nurse, take him to the sacristy, tie him, and then when he dies, put the bullet in him. The nurse says, yes, Dr. Menard. Meanwhile, back outside, it was late afternoon. It was hot. It was muggy. And Clyde, Peter, Anne, and Brianna did not know where they were going. They were lost. And then Brianna says, Clyde, let's rest a minute. It's hot. And do you even know where we're going? Clyde says, I don't even know where we're at. Peter says, I second that motion. And he says to Anne, let me lay down. And then Anne says, okay. And then Peter lays on the ground, and Anne decides to lay down right next to him to relax while they were catching their breath and trying to get their bearings at what they were at. Clyde says, maybe we should be close to town. And then Brianna sees something metallic in the thick undergrowth. She reaches for it and pulls it out, and she says, Clyde, look! Clyde sees what she pulled out, and then Clyde was surprised. It was an old Spanish helmet from the 16th century. And then he says to everybody, look what Brianna found. It's an old conquistador helmet. And then he looks around, and he could see headstones that were mostly covered by the thick undergrowth of the jungle. And then he says aloud, we must be in an old conquistador cemetery, he says. Peter says, oh, well, that's wonderful. Then suddenly, Anne starts screaming. Peter quickly lifts up his upper body to see what was going on, and he could see in horror that some hand had emerged from the ground and grabbed her hair. And then suddenly he felt a very sharp pain in his broken ankle. He looks and he sees that a decayed hand had emerged from the ground and grabbed at his broken ankle. He starts screaming. Clyde quickly runs over to help him. He smashes the hand that had Peter's ankle and then smashes the hand that had grabbed Anne's hair with the butt of the rifle. While he was doing that, Brianna was watching horror as in front of her a zombie was emerging from the ground. It was a conquistador zombie, and as it completely came out of the ground, Brianna just stood there, paralyzed in terror. Then the zombie lunged at her neck and took a huge chunk. She bled to death. Clyde ran over with Peter hobbling along too late. But then he quickly shoots at the zombie, but nothing. And not wanting to waste any more ammo, Clyde quickly uses the butt of the rifle to hit the zombie, knocking it on the ground. And then Peter quickly grabbed an iron cross that was being used as a marker from the undergrowth and smashed the zombie's skull in. Clyde quickly kneeled down and grabbed his wife's lifeless body. He began to cry, and Peter says to him, we don't have time, Clyde. Look, they're rising from their grave. Whatever's causing this is bringing those who've been dead for a long time back to life. We gotta get back to town. We gotta get back to the hospital, he says. And then Clyde lets his wife's lifeless body drop to the ground. And then he gets back up. And then him and Anne quickly help support Peter, and then they move away as fast as they could. They couldn't go too fast due to Peter's broken ankle. After they left the cemetery, the dead Spanish soldiers were all starting to come back to life as they were emerging from their graves, digging out of the ground. Night had fallen, and a wind was blowing. And Clyde, Peter, and Anne were just moving as fast as they could through the jungle. Peter says to the two of them, let go of me. I don't think I can make it. And then Anne says, you got to. They're close. Look, they're right behind us. And then the two quickly grabbed Peter and they kept on moving. They finally emerged from the jungle and they saw they were at the makeshift hospital. They ran to the front door of the makeshift hospital and began pounding on it, screaming for help. Dr. Menard, his nurse, and Lucas were still in there. Dr. Menard ran to answer the door, and he said to the three of them, "What's going on?" And then Clyde says, "It's your wife. She's dead. And the zombies, they're all over the place. They're outside. We barely made it," said Clyde. And then Peter said, "I broke my ankle in the car wreck." And then Dr. Menard helps Peter to a bed, and then he treats his broken ankle, and then he says to Peter, "We have to fight these things." And then he gives Peter his Glock 45 and an extra clip, and he says, "I'm going to the sacristy. I have some gasoline in there for the generator and some rags. I'm going to make a Molotov cocktail." And Clyde, Ann, and Peter decide to board up the giant front doors of the old church with whatever they could find. And then they took the rowboat, and then they turned it on its side for cover, while Clyde runs throughout the church to shut every window and board it up. In the process, he saw one zombie that was trying to climb in one window. He grabbed a shovel and beat it, and then shut the window. And then the final window, another zombie was coming through, and he blasted with the rifle. In the sacristy, Dr. Menard, his nurse, and Lucas were working hurriedly, making the Molotov cocktails. But, unbeknownst to them, the bodies of Fritz and several other of the recently dead patients that were not shot in the head came back to life and attacked them. Clyde heard the blood-curdling screams coming from the sacristy. He runs in there, and he sees Dr. Menard, his nurse, and Lucas dead, being munched on by the zombies. And then Clyde shoots the zombies dead with the rifle. Peter and Anne run into the sacristy to see what was going on, and they were horrified. And then Clyde says to them, "We got no time to mourn. Grab all these Molotov cocktails. We got a fight in our hands," he says. With everything ready, the three were now ready for the onslaught, and sure enough, the massive group of zombies outside quickly bust down the door of the old church and start coming in. And then they start lighting the Molotov cocktails and chucking it at the zombie horde. The zombie horde began going up in flames along with the church. And then Peter had noticed during the fight that the zombified Dr. Menard, his nurse, and Lucas emerged from the sacristy. Peter quickly uses the Glock 45 and shoots all three zombies in the head, and then they run, as Clyde had let out some more rounds from his rifle. The church went up like a tinderbox from the old dry rotting wood, and the three escaped through the back door. As they emerged in the back end of the church, it was quiet. And then Clyde stopped running. He saw Brianna, and he says, "Brianna, you're still alive!" Then the zombified Brianna lunged at Clyde's right arm and bit right into it. Clyde quickly pulls away, covering the bite wound, and he screams at Peter, the shooter. Peter quickly shoots her in the head without a second thought, and then he hobbles over to Clyde. Clyde says, "Don't worry about me. Let's get out of here now." Back on the boat, it was daylight, and then Clyde was looking very sick, and he says to Peter and Anne, "With the broken drive shaft, I think we can only make it as far as St. Cristobal." And then he says, "I'm so cold. It's freezing out here." Peter puts his hand over Clyde's forehead, and he says to Anne, he's burning with a fever. And then Anne asks Peter, "Is he going to turn?" Peter says, "I think so." Later, Peter emerges from below deck, and he says to Anne, "Well, I closed him up in the bilge. If he turns, he's not going to get out." And then Anne asks Peter, "Why are we keeping him around?" And then Peter says to Anne, "It's the only proof we have of what went on that island." And then Peter says, "Let's just turn on the radio and see if there's something happy on it." So Peter turns on the radio, and he finds a radio station broadcasting from all the way out in Miami with the grimmest news that he's ever heard.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to 94.7 CCO Radio Miami. If you're just tuning in now, the mayor of Miami is warning people to stay out of the city. Since the first reported zombie sighting, it has gotten out of control. Now there's reported zombies as far north as Fort Lauderdale. The National Guard seems powerless as they were overpowered, and we have just received reports that they pulled out of Pembroke Pines. The mayor is urging people to stay off the streets. For the love of God, he says, people, stay off the streets. And he's warning people, if you have no business in the city, stay out of the city.
Peter and Anne look at each other with shock. It was too late. Whatever evil was causing the dead to come back to life in the island has now reached Miami, as the city streets were overrun with zombies. Like and subscribe. The end.